For decades, people have been discussing seemingly nonsensical questions about starch-based foods. Are hot dogs sandwiches? Are they tacos? I think these questions are worth answering. An old high school friend and I had a lengthy discussion about the nature of breaded food. It became apparent that a defining line between what is what must be made, and no matter where that line is drawn, some peculiarities pop up. However, I believe we came up with the best answer that subdivides foods into the fewest possible categories. We call it positional starch theory. You may have heard of the cube rule. However, we believe that this method is overly simplistic and divisive. The cube rule categorizes hot dogs as a type of taco and lasagna as a type of cake. We who advocate positional starch theory think that not only is this divisive, it is wrong. We use a similar method of identifying starches as the cube rule, but we differ in a few key areas. We focus on naming our categories appropriately, and we have added geometry for 2 new categories. According to positional starch theory, starch-based food items are defined by imagining them as a 3-dimensional cube, then defining the food based on the number of sides the starch substance either supports or contains. I will outline each type of main starch family with some examples for each. First, there are 2 terms I will reference throughout: supporting starch and containing starch. A supporting starch is the primary starch of the item that holds the food up from certain doom. A containing starch is a starch that regularly supplements the supporting starch by keeping the food within the bounds of the supporting starch. These definitions are only applicable to what are known as regular starches. There is another class of starches called irregular starches that do not possess the same characteristics as regular starches. For the purposes of argument, all starches are categorized by the initial presentation of the starch, meaning that eating part of it will not change its family, even though it may change its geometry. There are 8 families in the regular starch class. First, there are planal starches, for those food items that are only supported from one side. Some planal starches include toast, hand-tossed pizza, potato chips, pancakes, and more. This is the simplest type of starch, and also the most common. It does not matter the width, length, or girth of the starch. A loaf of bread is considered a planal starch because it can exclusively support, not contain. Furthermore, a sub, burger, and peanut butter and jelly are all supported on the bottom and contained by the top. This is what we would categorize as a biplanal starch. However, there is another form of 2-sided starch which is more unconventional. This starch begins by supporting from the bottom and containing from the left or right, like a right angle, then orienting plus or minus 45 degrees so it looks like a V or absolute value of X graph. This is called the transverse starch, and is one of the only starches that has no supporting member and is comprised of only containing members. Hot dogs fall into the category of transverse starch because hot dogs are usually contained between 2 pieces of bread that pivot around a shared point. The 4th type of starch is the hyperbolic starch. Hyperbolic starches are comprised of 3 sides, usually 2 containing sides and 1 supporting side. For example, tacos and fold-over subs are hyperbolic starches. Fortune cookies also fit here because a fortune cookie can be thought of like a taco that has been bent inward. Like the 2-sided starches, there are 2 forms of 4-sided starchy food items. The first is the vasiform starch. The vasiform starch is reserved for those food types that are contained on 3 sides and supported on the 4th side in a cylindrical shape. This includes taquitos, Takis, and pigs in a blanket. The other type of 4-sided starch starts off like the transverse starch, making the V shape, but it adds a containing rhombus on the front and the back. This is called a rhombohedric starch and includes items like cone-shaped ice cream and bugles. This is the only other main family starch that has no supporting starch, but is comprised of only containing starches. Next we have the hemispheric starch, a starch that contains the food item on 4 sides and supports from the bottom side, leaving the top exposed. Foods that are part of the hemispheric starch family include Tostitos scoops, tortilla-lined bowls, any hollowed-out loaf of bread, and deep dish pizzas. A circumjacent starch is a starch which contains a food item on all 6 sides. A calzone is contained on all sides, or contained on 5 sides and supported by the bottom. Logically, fried chicken or any fried item that uses flour is also contained on all sides and is in the same family as a calzone. These 8 types of starches, planal, biplanal, transverse, hyperbolic, vasiform, rhombohedric, hemispheric, and circumjacent, make up the regular starches, starches that contain or support. However, there are also irregular starches that I will spend a brief time discussing. There are 2 families of starches that are worth mentioning here. First, there is the composite starch, or an inverse starch. Either category works well because they share a lot of overlap. A composite starch is a starch that is divided into many parts, like cereal or croutons in a salad. An inverse starch is a starch that does not support nor contain, but is itself contained, like cereal or croutons in a salad. However, not all inverse starches are composite starches. For example, a Big Mac has a piece of bread contained between 2 other pieces of bread, but is not a composite starch. A Big Mac is a hybrid starch that crosses between a biplanal starch and an inverse starch. The other type of irregular starch is categorized as a toroidal starch, which includes donuts and bagels. Toroidal starches are similar to planal starches, but connects back onto itself, creating a hole through the center. They are not considered vasiform starches because they do not inherently contain nor support anything. However, if you were to cut a bagel in half and serve it with cream cheese, it would be more similar to a planal starch than a toroidal starch. Although, I am open to eliminating this category altogether to get rid of unnecessary confusion. It must be noted though that donut holes would be a planal starch, and jelly-filled donuts or eclairs would be circumjacent starches. I hope to bring more people to adopt positional starch theory, as it categorizes all regular starches into 8 easy-to-understand categories that are not based on the likeness of a different type of food, but rather on the likeness of different foods to a geometrical counterpart. Thank you for watching. I will leave a link to the Q-Rule website in the description. I highly recommend you take a look because they are the frontrunners for geometrically based starch identification. Although we disagree on some things, we agree on much more, and starch theory would not be where it is today without them. If you disagree with any position I took in this video, please let me know in the comments. Have a nice day.